Hello, and welcome to our viewers in the United States and Europe. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first episode in our new virtual series, Resilience and Adaptation 2.0. This series is brought to you by 1014 and the American Council on Germany. With this series, we'd like to visit or actually revisit some of the topics that Katja and I talked about during our original Resilience and Adaptation series that we started just after the outbreak of COVID-19 about 3 years ago. And now we'd like to look at how much has or has not changed as a result of the pandemic. Through these events, we'd also like to explore whether there were any lessons learned and whether any of the pandemic-related changes have proven to be sustainable.
And I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director at 1014. Global supply chains suffered major disruptions during the pandemic. Economic interdependence has been called into question, with demands for onshoring or so-called friendshoring, at least for critical sectors. With most factories and production back at pre-pandemic levels, is global manufacturing, or do governments and industries rethink globalization and international trade?
We're joined today by two guests who met with us very early on in the first series of Resilience and Adaptation. We're joined by Shannon O'Neill and Thorsten. I want to thank you both very much for being back with us and for revisiting some of the topics that we talked about. Thorsten is co-founder and director of the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, and his areas of interest include the interplay between the United States, Europe, and non-Western powers in the making of global order and disorder. So Thorsten, herzlich willkommen. It's wonderful to see you again. And Shannon O'Neill is the Vice President and Deputy Director of Studies, and also the Nelson and David Rockefeller Senior Fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's an expert on global trade, supply chains, Mexico, Latin America, and democracy. And I have to put in a plug, the author of a brand new book, which we will be drawing from today. It's titled The Globalization Myth, Why Regions Matter. Shannon, a warm welcome to you as well. Thank you for joining us.
Appreciate it. But before we get started, we would like to remind everyone that the ACG and 1014 are both independent, nonpartisan organizations. So the views expressed during this conversation are those of the two experts, Shannon and Thorsten. Also, if you would like to ask questions in the audience, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. Let us know who your question is directed to, and we will do our best to integrate your questions into the conversation.
So Shannon and Thorsten, it was actually May of 2020 that we were together to talk about globalization. And you both said that you did not think that globalization would be a casualty of the COVID-19 pandemic. Fast forward nearly 3 years to April 2023, and an environment with multiple disruptions, right? Not just the pandemic, we've got the war in Ukraine, we have all of the disrupted supply chain issues that we've seen over the last few years, rising inflation, basically a situation that some analysts have described as a poly-crisis. And so I'd like to maybe start with you, Shannon, and ask how globalization is faring at this point, 3 years after the pandemic hit. And yeah, that's sort of the opening question for us for today.
Well, thanks for that. And thanks for that memory, taking us back to May 2020. That was a really fun time, as we all had, right? So I'm glad where we are today. But it is interesting what's happened over these last 3 years. And I would say, from our conversation then, we weren't sure that COVID was going to be the thing that changed globalization. I think in some ways, that is right. You look back at what has happened over these 3 years, and we had, a once in a century, perhaps, supply shock as the world shut down. We had a once in a many years, maybe generation demand shock as everybody stopped buying, suitcases and work clothes and started buying laptops and leisure wear. We had a whole logistics snafu as planes were grounded and ships were on the wrong side of the ocean and all of that. And what we found is, we focus a lot on the sectors that have bottlenecks, and for sure there are many there. But lots of sectors and lots of different industries, even with these, once in a generation shocks, within a few months, we had, toilet paper back on the shelves, and we had laptops and phones and the things that people wanted. And we had those things. And in large part, I would say that was because of international supply chains being much more resilient and flexible, if in a stressful way than we would have imagined, given just the sheer shock that happened to the global system. Now, that said, I do think we've seen a lot of movement in this last 3 years that was based somewhat on what was happening before COVID, right? We have seen for the last decade plus, we've seen the rise of automation and accelerating that in manufacturing, AI and all the things we're talking about, that had been started before, but was really growing. We have seen the effects of demographics and labor cost changes in various places around the world. Those were started before COVID, but have accelerated as those shifts continue. So some places that used to be cheap are no longer cheap, and with automation, maybe cheap labor isn't as important depending on sectors. And then I think the biggest real shift that we've seen, which has less to do with COVID and more to do with the things that you brought up in your polycrisis depiction, is geopolitics. And as I look at the rest of this decade, if the beginning of the century was really about markets and efficiency and that sort of thing affecting supply chains, this next decade is really going to be about geopolitics, just changing the rules and with governments changing the costs of inputs and the sort of profit and losses in various ways. So that's, as I look forward, we've seen a huge shift in globalization and supply chains, but it's more due to geopolitics, I would say, and other factors than necessarily the shock of COVID.
Let me maybe sort of ask a little bit of a follow-up, because I'd like to maybe unpack these buckets a little bit, right? I mean, automation, you mentioned automation, demographics, geopolitics as being factors that have contributed to where we are today. But you also pointed out that this is not something that just happened over the last 2 or 3 years. This is part of an ongoing trend. Do you feel that some of the developments in each of these areas were sort of sped up as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown? Do you think we would be where we are today if we hadn't had the pandemic to deal with, for example?
There's definitely an acceleration, I would say, because, as we all know with supply chains is that once you set them up, they're pretty sticky, right? Once you find a supplier that will deliver what you need on Tuesday morning at the right price, at the right quality, you don't want to go out and just say, hey, by the way, maybe I'll go to Malaysia and see if I can find someone else, right? You already have these pretty sticky networks. And we see that in the economic data, historically, maybe a little more percent of supply chains will move each year, just because if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? And we get that in our general life in many ways. And what COVID, I think, did, because it was such a shock, is trends where people were already saying, okay, my profit margin producing in this geographic network used to be X, now it's X minus something. I'm not quite as profitable because labor costs are more, or I need automation, or whatever it is, or my markets have moved to different places and the like. But what COVID did was really, I think, you had a moment where you had a break and some costs went way up. Other, markets shifted. And so all of a sudden, what had been like, I'm losing market share, or maybe I'm losing my profit margin a little bit, but the cost of moving is too much. I think it brought a case where all of a sudden the cost of discussing either the next amount of capacity or even the capacity you already had was brought into shape. And then you also have, partly related to COVID, but partly independently, I would say, or more independently, I would say, is you just had a real heating up of the geopolitics, right? Whether that's US, China, or whether that's Russia and Ukraine, obviously, those things really just accelerated much faster than I would say they did in the 2010s, even though there were tensions in the 2010s, of course.
Right. I mean, this is just it. There have been tensions before, and there will be tensions again in the future. But I do think that we are in an exceptional moment when you think about the U.S.-China tensions, when you think about the war in Ukraine. These are not, in part, not things that one might have anticipated 3 years ago. that we would be where we are. So I would like to bring Thorsten into the conversation. Thankfully, this is not set up as a debate with two radically different opinions and viewpoints, because I'm sure that much of what Shannon said are points that Thorsten would agree with. But Thorsten, let me sort of start by asking you the same general question that we had started with Shannon, which is what's your take on how globalization is faring 3 years later, 3 years after where we were the last time we came together in this constellation?
Thank you very much, Katja and Steve, for the invite. It's great to be back with you and also with you, Shannon. And I'm very happy to do this. Where is globalization, and did the pandemic have the big impact that we thought or didn't think at the time we had? I very much agree with Shannon that, first of all, I think the war, in terms of how Germany organizes itself and its thinking about interdependence, the war that Russia started in Ukraine will have a much bigger impact than the pandemic. Pandemic kind of warmed us up for, sensitized us in terms of risks of dependencies. But I think the pandemic alone wouldn't have led to a shift in thinking. But we see a fundamental rethink of our illusions and delusions about interdependence across the political spectrum. And that is much more driven by the Kremlin-Beijing analogy than it is by the experience of the pandemic in my view. And Germany in particular was a country that very much profited from globalization, unlike many other countries in the global south that, or like many at least, saw some of the terms as unfair. Germany was the country that was perfectly adapted to a world in which others took care of our security. We got cheap energy from Russia, and for a long time we had China as a complementary market. That had started to unravel already with China becoming, moving up the value chain and becoming a fierce competitor of Germany. Now you saw the end of cheap Russian energy and turning energy into a weapon. And Grandfather Biden is still taking care of our security, but that will not be like that for eternity. So we need to fundamentally rethink our whole model, and our assumptions about interdependence are some of those. And in the kind of geopolitical environment, I think Olaf Scholz, our chancellor, fiercely kind of defends globalization, and he says that the prophets of deglobalization, they are on the really wrong path. And I think the formula that seems to be the lowest common denominator these days in the debate here seems to be de-risking, that everybody can kind of come around or like can agree on. And then the question is, what are the risks, and how decisive do we need to be in terms of starting to mitigate them? I think that's where the debate right now is. But I do think it's much more Russia's war and the intensifying competition, geopolitical competition with the Chinese party state that's driving forward a rethink, mostly of dependencies on China, not totally of global supply chains. More resilience. An Australian, a New Zealand colleague who presented New Zealand's new foreign and security strategy kind of summarized it quite neatly. It's a move from, in terms of the model, from just in time to just in case. And I think that sums up this quite neatly.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, and thank you also for underscoring sort of the role of geopolitics, which Shannon had brought up before, because I think that's crucial and critical. But also thank you for sort of pointing to the the German narrative specifically, because I would agree with you that obviously Corona was a shock to the system and to the German economy. But really the radical changes that we've seen in the German economy have come about as a result of recognition of Germany's dependence on Russian energy, and basically the elimination of Russian energy over the course of the past year in Germany, which is really quite spectacular and not something that anybody would have imagined. So as you, Thorsten, continue to think about the German, model, and you started to talk about this a little bit, is Germany sort of drawing the lessons that it has been made aware of because of the dependence on Russia when it comes to its relationships with other parts of the world, and particularly with China? I mean, I think it's fair to say that the relationship between Germany and Russia was fairly simple: hard currency for energy. Its relationship with countries like China are far more complex. And we're seeing a debate in Germany about, a new China policy that's supposed to come out, and sort of some rethinking. But do you think it goes far enough?
I mean, the proof of the pudding is in eating, and I think at least we're having a debate, and that's a start. I think China is rightly at the center of attention, because I personally think that those who move from a morally charged notion of change through trade that kind of ennobled the pursuit of profit goals with non-democratic states, with the belief that this would contribute to ultimately helping to turn them into open societies. We risk going the opposite direction, also very morally charged, and say we only trade with democracies and countries like us. And I think that would be entirely foolish. It would be nice if the world was full of Norways that we can engage in with independencies, but it's simply not feasible economically to do that. And I think hopefully we will be able to discard that notion and focus on exaggerated dependencies on the other great authoritarian power that's led by an ideologically and motivated and power hungry leader that is China. And there we're only starting the debate, and I can also empathize with those in the chancellery who say Germany is about to witness quite a shock to the system in terms of waking up in a high energy price world. We need to do a complete reorganization of the German economic model anyway with decarbonization. So let's not, too trigger happily open up another front with China, and let's focus on reducing the kind of most decisive vulnerabilities. And I think what everybody agrees on, and that's at least the good news, is that we do need to reduce our dependencies on natural resources, industrial pre-products, whether it's on China or other countries that there are single points of failure, but unfortunately there are quite a few single points of failure in that, or excessive dependencies on China. And that's at least where there is consensus. But in terms of the market dependencies of large German companies, there's no consensus. The CEOs of the likes of Siemens, BMW, Daimler, Volkswagen, they're all in terms of increasing their investment on the Chinese market, and at least the chancellery, unlike some other parts of the government, is not actively discouraging them from doing that. So we don't necessarily have agreement on that. And what worries me most is that we need to make sure that in 10 years we don't wake up and said, had we only thought about the dependencies we're now entering in our very unique version of our decarbonization process, because Germany is the country that has now given up nuclear power. We want to get out of coal. That leaves us with renewable energy. And our finance minister, Christian Lindner, memorably said in the German parliament soon after the start of Russia's invasion, kind of almost in a conversion moment, he said, renewable energies are freedom energies. But right now for Germany, they're unfortunately unfreedom energies to a large degree, because with regard to solar, we're 95% dependent on China. With regard to batteries, we're too dependent on China, not in terms of a single point of failure, but very much. And in terms of wind power, our wind industry with Siemens Gamesa and in Europe with Vestas and others risk going down the same path as the German and European solar industry. So we actively need to work against that. Otherwise, we wake up in a world where we are set to increase our dependencies on China in all key technologies of our energy transition, and that would be simply trading our dependence on Russia with trading with one on China.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Thorsten. I think, before we maybe focus a little bit more, zoom a little bit more on the China issue and our dependencies on China, what we do about it, I just kind of like to take a step back and ask Shannon about the geopolitical issues. So Thorsten said the war in Ukraine probably had the biggest impact on globalization from a German point of view. And of course, because of the special dependency on energy from Russia, that, is of course very obvious and on the plate. But how about from a US point of view? So you mentioned these geopolitical aspects that factored in, but how significant were they compared to the other aspects that you mentioned from a US point of view? And then let's go to the regions. What role do the regions play in all of this moving forward?
So obviously the Russia-Ukraine war is a huge hit to the system and in a break in many ways, right? With Russia being thrown out of the global financial system and sanctions and things. So anything that came from there is, it's a huge break. And so that's energy. It's also, gases like neon and other things and food. And so we've seen really reverberations in that for sure through international supply chains. I would say, while those are incredibly important and very visceral in many ways, one thing we have seen over the last decade plus is just this rise and return of industrial policy. And so, just to put some data on it, in the last 15 years between the US, China, and the EU, they put in place over 20,000 subsidies. And so just that huge mass of changes in structures and a benefit here or a tax there or, quotas or licenses or whatever these things are, it really is reshaping the relationship. And not all of those, but many of those have a geopolitical lens on them, right? It's trying to de-integrate particular sectors or industries. It's, as Thorsten was saying, it's trying to ensure that you're not as dependent, creating a domestic industry or an industry in other places that you feel, push comes to shove, you would have access to. I mean, we saw with Russia, Ukraine, when push did come to shove, you don't have access to those things anymore, right? For geopolitical reasons. And so you look around the world and you say, okay, critical minerals, are mostly processed and refined in China. If they decided to stop giving, sending those out to the world, or the world decided to stop accepting them for various reasons, where would we be able to turn? So you're starting to see, all these carrots and sticks in terms of policies put in place. Some that are, slower going, some are preparing for that. And I think, one of the biggest shifts, Steve, as we were talking about in the earlier part, the shift before COVID to after COVID. Before COVID, you saw a lot of these policies, but some of them were frictions entered into supply chain. So they were tariffs, or they were licenses, or they were things. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of years, an acceleration is sanctions or export controls or bans and the like. So a harder break than the kind of, making it slightly more expensive or significantly more expensive to, you just can't do it, right? And things like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act have a potential to create even more of a break with all sorts of industries or all sorts of inputs that come from Xinjiang or come from potential forced labor. So I think, there we're seeing the geopolitics, Russia-Ukraine is an important aspect, but I think it's this broader and pretty comprehensive, in-depth basis that's happening and across lots of countries there. And in terms of regions, and I know we'll get to probably, bigger discussions of the global South, and there's interesting, all these kind of middle powers, let's say, or, countries that are not these three big blocks. In some ways, there's autonomy there. Some of them are doing their own policies, right? There, India has policies and Brazil has policies and others are doing their policies. In some ways, they are taking the lead on things like regional free trade agreements, right? You saw ASEAN really push for RCEP and others. So you're seeing some agency there and activism and pushing the system in various directions. But in some ways, they also have to react, right? Because when sort of these organizations are sort of, Europe, US, and China face off with each other, sometimes it gets to a zero sum, and you're asking or forcing other countries to make decisions in particular sectors about whether you're going to be on this side or you're going to be on that side. And I think we're at the beginning of that, not the end of that, where for particular industries or sectors, and more than in the past, right? The national security has become a much broader term and more things fall within it. I think we're going to see more of that as we go forward in the years, where you're going to, ask more blocks forming and which side are you going to be on, and it'll be harder to choose, and at least in some particular sectors.
Thanks so much, Shannon. I just want to zoom in on, you just said, countries are wondering, on which side they find themselves, from the US putting out the industry policies. So I'd just like to ask Thorsten, I think the EU or European countries have been rather surprised by the return of industry policies from the US, and I think now they're wondering on which side are they on, so what about the transatlantic relationship in times of industrial policies? And what's the EU's answer to that? We know there are a couple of acts that the Commission proposed, Net Zero Industrial Act, Raw Materials Act. So is that now competition to the US, or what's happening? Where, the regions, do they span the Atlantic, or do we need to look regional in Europe and in the US?
Thank you, Katja. This is not narrowly my area of expertise, so I just give you my very superficial read on this. For me, from a European perspective, it's simply a fact of life that industrial policy is back. It has been back, it has been there in China for a long time. It's back in the US, and in the French mind, it was never gone to begin with. So I think that's just a fact of life, and we simply need, and it's not entirely clear that the US or Chinese way of doing this, that anybody has found the perfect way of doing that with wasting the least taxpayer money along the way, although that's probably not the goal of the Chinese party state in doing that. But it should be our goal. So we need to come up with smart industrial policy of our own. I think part of the outrage about the IRA is that simply the EU cannot reciprocate because we cannot, the EU doesn't have a taxing authority. It cannot give these tax credits, the nifty way the US has designed that. So we need to come up with good ways to do that ourselves wherever possible. Of course, we do need to kind of try to make common cause with the US and other like-minded market democracies, but has always been the case. That's not news that like-minded market democracies are in competition with one another. And I think the alarm in Europe is mostly a result of maybe partly a superficial read of the Inflation Reduction Act, which also had a lot of good news that America is kind of moving in this direction, is a monumental thing, and in general is good news for the world. But it's kind of maybe a reading of some of the stipulations in the act and reading too much into how that sausage was made. I think it wasn't necessarily directed against the EU. The lesson should rather be that Europeans failed to lobby early on. What I heard is that, this one crazy senator from West Virginia, that was the swing vote. He actually thought that he would have, Europe included in the formula that he pushed for. He just didn't know that Europe didn't have a free trade agreement with the US, but the fact of the matter is that the Canadians were much better at lobbying and early on in the congressional process, and we should that should be the lesson learned. But I think part of the alarm is also a result of the conflation of both the IRA that Europeans didn't have on the radar early on, and the energy price differences that are not the result necessarily of subsidies or the IRA, but that, of course, give us great reason for concern, because most of the German companies, at least if they're thinking about, to the degree they're thinking of, decreasing their exposure to the Chinese market, they would much rather think about, expanding in the US right now if they're industrial companies than, going to Europe. But that partly has to do in energy intensive industries. It has to do with the sheer energy cost differential that gives us quite a bit of headache, at least in Germany, which is a country that still had a fairly high degree of energy intensive industrial manufacturing until today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for that. I'd like to, maybe bring the conversation back to the issue and the role of regions that you've both talked about, but particularly Shannon, that is your area of focus, because you talked about certain trends prior to the pandemic that might have been accelerated during the pandemic. I think one of the takeaways from the pandemic period that some observers and analysts had was that companies would start sourcing more locally within their region rather than globally, because we were seeing supply chain disruptions and other difficulties, other challenges. Of course, as you said before we went live, you did a lot of the research for your book on why regions matter before the pandemic. So you were obviously tuned into what was going on at that time. But can you just, for us, sort of flesh out a little bit why regions matter so much, and why you think that this is a very important trend? It's not mutually exclusive to globalization, of course, but it's sort of setting a different accent and creating a different kind of awareness.
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. And I think as we talk about sort of where we're headed, it's useful at looking at where we've been. In the book, the title of the book is The Globalization Myth, and the myth that I want to expose, or that I talk about in there, is really that this last 30, 40 years, this time of global supply chains and hyperglobalization, is as global as we seem to think it is, right? Is the way we talk about it. And I would argue that really what we've seen over the last 40 years is more regionalization than globalization. And let me just talk a bit about that. So if you look over, sort of this last 40 years, this time of creation of global supply chains, what we've seen, one is actually not all that many countries participated in quote unquote globalization over these last 40 years, right? There's only about 24 countries that saw trade transform their economies, right? Where trade as a percentage of GDP doubled or more. And we see dozens more, 89 countries to be precise, that saw trade as part of their economy, GDP, stay the same or even decline. So we've seen a good number of countries that deglobalized from 1980 to, before the pandemic, this time. So I think that's one thing is as we think about, globalization, not all that many countries really participated or fully participated. And then the second is that when companies went abroad and money went abroad, which it did, right? We've seen trade go from 2 trillion to 32 trillion from over the last 50 years. But when they did, it didn't necessarily go to the other side of the world. And we do have examples, sure, of global trade, of course, right? But the majority of trade actually stayed much closer. And the average good today that's traded travels 3,000 miles. And that's a distance between New York and Los Angeles, basically.
Mhm.
So I think that gives us a sense of how much, yes, people did go abroad, they did go international, and that brought profits and that brought new customers, and that brought all sorts of things, but they didn't usually go to the other side of the world. And in many ways, this is the story of international supply chain. So, iPhones are sold all around the world, but the actual production and the supply chain is pretty much all in Asia. And that's where this sort of intra-regional trade, and that's where regions as a sort of an economic force really came about. And the other thing that's interesting of this last 40 years is that you have fewer countries participating, they tend to go closer by, and what you've gotten are these three big powerhouse regions, a European one that we've been talking about, an Asian one where China is part of that, obviously a center of that, and a North American one. And between those three, 90% of all trade happens. The rest of the world, dozens and dozens of countries in South America and Africa and Middle East and South Asia, it's only 10% of global trade. And they tend not to be as regionalized or as tied to their neighbors as those other three places. And I think that phenomenon, which is, where we were pre-COVID and where we still are today, is really important to understand in the sense of that's already the way the world is set up. And now when you factor in geopolitics or you factor in worries about resilience in COVID, just in case versus just in time, that Thorsten was talking about, when you start factoring that in, this regional aspect tends to be safer in some ways, partly because you already have free trade agreements, partly because some of these are countries that you already have like-minded markets, whether that's Europe or whether that's North America and the like. And so I think that kind of centripetal force for commerce is getting more intense as we see these big disruptions in other parts of the world as we go forward. So I think that's where the regional aspect plays in. And I guess one thing I would throw out there is, I think the real question in this next phase of globalization that we've entered, because I don't see us deglobalizing, but I think we're changing. And I think the footprints will change in many ways. I think the next question is really, can those countries that were left on the sidelines in many ways, right, didn't grow as fast, didn't hook into global supply chains or international supply chains, can they do that this time and do it in ways that's helpful to diversify their economies and make them more robust and resilient and grow faster? Or because of some of these trends we're talking about, do they get kind of left on the margins again, right? They're just raw outputs, commodities that go out and then they get finished goods back in, but they don't get the sort of, technological jumps or the learning by doing that happens in that kind of meaty middle of a supply chain. And I think it's a real question for lots of parts of these worlds.
So this sort of really piques my interest, and I have to ask, even though I know that this is sort of looking into the future and it's always very hard to anticipate what's coming next, but the comment that you just made about how certain footprints are going to be changing, how we're moving into a period where things will continue to evolve, perhaps not along the same trajectory as the trends that we've seen in the past, but there will be changes, and some of them, might literally be right around the corner. And so I guess the question I have for you is what do you anticipate that global order will look like in the not too distant future?
So I do think the fragmentation that we've been seeing will continue. I don't see, a hard break between the US and China in the way that some people envision, but I do think we're already seeing particular industries, it will get harder and harder, right? Semiconductors is the one that we hear a lot about, but as you look at, all kinds of minerals, as you look at pharmaceuticals potentially, as you look at large capacity batteries, electric vehicle batteries and the like, I do think we're going to start seeing a de-integration in that sense. And so then the question is, where does some of this go, right? We've seen, for instance, in the last 5 years, an exodus of electronics that come from China to the United States. Now, there's a record number of electronics being sold or exported from China to the United States, but the percentage, it used to be about 43% of all electronics coming to the United States came from China. Now it's down to 31%. So a huge exodus in the overall market share. It's just that we just buy a lot more electronics than we did in 2018, 2019. Those have moved. They've moved some to Mexico. So there's a regionalization aspect to that, a lot to Southeast Asia, right? Because you already have these very robust supply chains. And so you keep the access to all those different parts makers, the semiconductors and the screens and the microphones and all the other parts, but it moves to other countries there. So I think we're going to see some of that. That's one industry where you're already seeing somewhat of an exodus. Some of those that are more national security sensitive, I think you will start seeing more divide, and it might go where you go to, countries that have security agreements, right? Whether that's NATO, whether that's, the Quad, whether that's, you can imagine kind of what those might look like. And the same on the China side, the Belt and Road countries are those that they have much more, formal or informal alliances with. The other thing I would put on the table is we have seen over this last 5 years a real rewriting of the global trade architecture. We have seen deal after deal signed, right? We have the CPTPP, we have RCEP, we have potentially this Mercosur EU agreement, we have a continental African free trade agreement. You've seen a lot of dynamism really in terms of that. And that really matters for trade, right? This is not the hard break stuff, but this is, if you're part of the CPTPP, then you don't pay tariffs within it. And if you're a country not part of that, like the United States, you are paying tariffs vis-a-vis others. So I think you will start seeing movements in just the profitability. This is not about the national security stuff. This is just real commerce. And if your goods cost 10, 11, 12% more because you pay tariffs that other people don't, then you're going to be shut out of those markets. So I think those agreements, as they come into play, will have more and more effect on just shaping the less sensitive types of trade, but which is really the bulk of trade around the world.
That's really something that I'm really interested in. You just said, it's about commerce. It's not about national security. But I think, in a lot of these new acts, national security concerns are kind of baked into that in some ways. And, we talked about before, does it make sense, or can we prevent even doing business with non-democratic states? Thorsten, you said, we cannot afford to over-moralize, globalization or trade. So there's no way we can totally decouple, being engaged with non-democratic countries. So how does that all play into like the regionalization and friendshoring? So how much, is what the rationale behind it? So how much is, our national security concerns at stake, ethic questions at stake, or is it just convenience? It's like, it's so much easier to like do business shorter ways, easier production or whatever, or do we like to do business with states that are similar, in our region? So what motivates us? I don't know, Thorsten, do you want to go ahead?
I do think, I didn't want to come across as totally discarding other concerns except for profit and convenience, not at all. And we have ESG criteria in environmental sustainability, and we have very hard human rights kind of stipulations increasingly also baked into laws. So that's all there, and that's the minimum thing economic relations and trade relations need, or like, that's at least what they need to meet. But what I said is like, we cannot simply just, and then who is a friend? Friendshore is like, today's friend can be, I guess, is Orban's Hungary a friend now or not? At least it's a country that Germany invests a lot in and does so very successfully. So this whole term friend, I don't find particularly helpful on that front. And I think is mostly, most of all, it's important to divide up dependencies. We will not be, self-reliant and sovereign in any technology, and nor should we, and can we aspire to do so as Germany or even as Europe. But we need to kind of divide up our dependencies, and 10 dependencies on non-democratic countries are much better than a single point of failure with one authoritarian superpower. That doesn't, that all goes to say, I'm also very happy wherever we can work with like-minded democracies and invest in, and we've seen that with Japan. It's much easier to do a data sharing agreement with a like-minded player. We should, by all means do so. And I think we should be particularly sensitive when it comes to critical infrastructure, and there indeed we should try to limit our dependencies on countries that are right now like-minded, and in those areas we should also, I think, as Europeans, aspire to master the key technologies ourselves, although I think we're still quite far away from that in key areas.
Shannon, I have one viewer question. I think that kind of falls into that discussion. Maybe you can answer that question and then comment on my more broader question. So the viewer asked, driver shortages, logistics provider capacity issues, inflation, shipping delays, increased freight costs, depleted inventory levels, labor shortages, and demand peaks are affecting the global supply chain. What is being done to address these issues? So when you talk about, the regions and what makes regionalization so attractive, maybe that could factor into your answer.
So, I mean, lots of these things have hit, and we've had conversations over the last 3 years about, what is transitory and what is permanent. And some things were obviously transitory, and just that, planes weren't flying and 50% of cargo moves in the bellies of passenger planes. And so if people aren't taking vacations, then you can't find places to put some of your goods. Same things with ships and the like. So some of that stuff has eased out. But we are also finding some of the other things are a bit longer lasting, right? We've seen labor shortages in various places, and some of that is, COVID related. People were taken out of the workforce and don't want to come back in. Migration stopped in some places, or illegal migration, which would bring workforces in. The United States, we're probably missing 1 to 2 million migrants that we would have had if COVID had not hit, that would have come in through the regular channels. So some of that stuff is a bit longer lasting, and some of it is demographics, right? You see, already China's labor force is smaller and will get smaller. And, one estimate is over the next 15 years, 100 million people will leave the Chinese labor force. The US labor force is only 165 million people. Think just the size of it. It's, majority of that just leaving the labor force. And some of that started already. So now how are governments dealing? Well, part of the push for automation is sort of, capital versus labor, and there's new technologies and the like, and feeding that into the supply chain. Some of it is in dealing with some of these shocks is bringing things closer or diversifying. So, as Thorsten was saying, you're not relying just on one place for all of your sourcing of a particular part of your product. You have different loops around the world, right? You have a European loop that just serves Europe. You have a North American one that just serves North America, and same perhaps for Asia and other parts of the world. So I think you're starting to see different companies take different tactics, frankly, on a lot of this. And some of it may be slightly inflationary, right? That it costs more if you set up those loops, but some may be finding actually that because of technology advances, because of when you put that next part of capacity in, you can have much more productive workers. And so, yes, you pay them more because they're based in places that are high wage and high, environmental protections and that kind of thing. But because of the technologies, the output you get per worker is so much higher than when you had sort of old school manufacturing bases, that actually your profits are the same or even higher. So I think we're seeing a huge transition in manufacturing and services and all of this. And so some of these shocks are really challenging and are going to be hard to get rid of, but then other ones actually, I think, bring innovation. And then we're seeing some of that appear in lots of different industries as well. So I don't think it's all a bad news story that we can't get over, right? And I wanted to say a word on the sort of, do we only work with democracies and friendshoring and all of this? And one interesting thing I see is many of the free trade agreements that we have seen go to these sort of higher, much more comprehensive and sort of higher level, right? They include environmental issues and labor issues and government procurement issues and all kinds of ESG issues. And so that is one way. It's not exactly like, monitoring your elections, but it is sort of, what is your work environment like? And so you see that sort of like-minded countries coming together. We're going to operate in this way where we can go. And then, we see this, for instance, in the USMCA, the successor to NAFTA. They have a labor part in there. And so lots of, the USTR, US Trade Representatives gone and said, okay, this factory, there's a complaint that you're not allowing unions form. And there's been several of these cases. There's also been cases in Canada and the US in various industries. So you're seeing countries work together in that sense and decide to sign on because the benefits of increased trade at, lower costs and sort of preferred access are worth it. So I think we're seeing that. And then we're also seeing some of these, global standards. And Europe is obviously famous for its Brussels effect. But right, if they put in the carbon border adjustment mechanism, you'll see what trade happens, right? There'll be a cost there. Or, the United States back in the 70s put in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which, some businesses would say, well, it makes it hard for us to operate in other countries. But it also means that US-based companies that are going into countries have to meet certain standards or else they get penalized at home. And most live up to that standard. And sometimes countries really like when US companies come in because they know they won't be asking for, money under the table because they can't, because of what happens at home. And I have talked with, various leaders in Latin American countries, and one at one point was desperate to have US companies come in and bid on construction for the Olympics that they were going to hold, precisely because of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as they wanted those contracts to be up to a certain standard and be much more transparent and open. And if they had US companies participating, then they could make all of them that way. And so I think there are some areas where it's not about, are you a democracy or an authoritarian, but what are the standards for global commerce that kind of rise to what we would think is a higher quality level?
We'll get to that in a minute, but let me just fold in one viewer question. Thorsten, maybe that's for you, since we're talking about demographics in China and friendshoring. Let's just fold this question in. So, is there anything China can do at this point to counter the onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring trend out of China that the US and allies have begun in advanced technology? Does China have any weapons or bargaining chips up its sleeve apart from threats to curb US companies or European companies' access to the Chinese market?
I think they do, and I think they're using them. Right? So one is access to the market, sure, right? If you want to come in here, you have to be nice to us, right? You don't say things about us that we don't like, don't put in place laws that we don't like, and so they're doing that. The other is they are, access, when we've been talking about this, our worries about access to their exports, right? They are produce the vast majority of solar panels. They produce critical minerals. They produce all kinds of things that if they decided to turn off that spigot, would leave lots of industries around the world, in particular countries, very vulnerable. So, that's part of why we're doing all of this reshoring and friendshoring, or thinking about doing it. But they have that power. They haven't done it necessarily, but they have that power. And then the third thing that they have, which I think we'll see more and more of China doing, is sort of the competition for markets around the rest of the world, right? As we think about, for instance, electric vehicle cars and who's going to sell those. We're talking about the IRA, and, European countries feel a bit dismissed that, the US has put so many subsidies and you have to, their companies might move to the US to manufacture because of the subsidies and the like. But the real competitor out there is China, who makes far more electric vehicle battery cars at far more reasonable prices and the like. And so who's going to supply the 4 billion people or 5 billion people that live in the rest of the world? Chinese are potentially going to win those markets. So what is that I think too is, best defense is good offense, but their offense is go out and win those other markets. And because of their substantial market power, if not dominance in many areas, they can do what monopolies and oligopolies do, which is lower the prices to drive other people out of business and then put it back up, right? They do have a lot of pricing power that makes it very hard for US or European-based competitors who don't have that luxury, to go into these markets. So I think there's a lot of tools China has that they could use if they're not already using in particular markets.
Thorsten, what's your take on that?
I have nothing to add.
So let me maybe jump in then. This has been such a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation that we've had, and we're really close to the end at this point. But I want to bring up something else. I find this conversation about democracies versus authoritarian states really interesting, and how values-based trade plays a real role in relationships that are developed. And we've kind of touched on the Global South, but we haven't really talked about the Global South that much. And it seems to me that there's a real competition between the free market democracies or the West and China in sort of winning the countries of the global South onto their side. And it seems as if we in the West are not really doing that well. China seems to be a very attractive partner to many of these countries. And the question that I have is, what can Europe and the United States do ideally together to try to appeal to these countries in the global South and make them part of our, economic success?
Who do you want to go?
Whoever wants to go first.
Why don't you start? Because I know that you focus on these issues. Oh, I was going to, Thorsten, you start since you focus on the global South and those issues.
No, I mean, I'll hand over to you, Shannon, soon, but I think a first order of business is not to, first of all, to realize that the global South is a term that obscures more than it actually elucidates. How do you say in English? It's a very mixed bag of countries that are not part of what is traditionally known as the West, with many different interests and so on. But I think if you want to generalize in terms of approach, then I think it would be this: let's think about our relationship as Europeans with these countries from the vantage point of what are their interests, and not come to them, oh, now we discovered that China and Russia, and we want you on our side, and that's why we're coming to you. That's a pretty bad conversation starter. And to actually try to meet them where their joint interests in economic and other success. And I think you can, since we're talking about trade and economic relations primarily in this, and not in terms of how we kind of negotiate together or not at the UN or in other international fora, I think and we can start with different African countries where Europeans have mostly looked at this from the framework of kind of economic assistance and aid, and is as if these were needy basket cases that we should rush to the help of. Much rather, let's see this mixed bag of countries as countries that want to shape their own future and destinies in the centuries that will not align most likely with either China or the US in this emerging new Cold War, and that they want to kind of pursue their own interests. And let's see how we can interact with them in a smart way wherever there are common economic and other political climate crisis related interests. And let's see Africa more as partners and markets than we see it as recipients of our also enlightened largesse.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Thorsten. And the last word goes to you, Shannon, in terms of any thoughts, ideas, recommendations for how we can get more transatlantic cooperation when it comes to dealing with some of these countries that have really been left behind or are on the periphery.
Yes, I mean, I think there is a place for the U.S. and Europe to do this together. And I would just echo what Thorsten has just said is that, lots of these countries are the countries that didn't benefit that much over the last 40 years. I mean, many of these countries in South America and Africa have been the biggest victims of what economists call premature deindustrialization, right? So they lost their manufacturing sector before they got out of the middle income trap. And so, as we think about working with them, I think one is, at least I will speak for the United States, but I think Europe sometimes has this as well, is, thinking that, this sort of protectionism where we need to make sure, if you want to be globally competitive, the reality is today you need international supply chains. No country alone, not even China, can do it by themselves in a competitive way. And so as you think about how you're going to set up these supply chains, what about some of these countries? And so some of that will involve opening up markets and engaging them, and understanding that some parts of a manufacturing process will not be in Germany or not be in the United States or be in France or the like. It'll be somewhere else, and opening up to that. And then the other part is some of these countries, need, as we make a green transition, as you try to recreate supply chains and all the links along the way that are not, let's say, in Asia, but in South America or in Africa. There's a lot of, technical expertise and setups and investments and sunk costs that down the road it can be competitive, but you need sort of that initial oomph to get in there, right? You need sort of the outlays, and that can come from governments as well. So I think part of it is, it can't just be saying, don't buy from China. You have to provide an alternative, and you have to provide the carrots and the financing to do so. But I think there's also a place to help them come up with a win-win situation, right? Which is, as countries try to make a green transition, as we try to set global standards, make sure that these countries are at the table. And so far, we have been less interested often in the, Europe and the US than perhaps China has. And at least, the illusion of inclusion, of bringing them to the table, I think that's something that we could do better, is actually including them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Shannon and Thorsten, many, many thanks. This hour has gone by in just minutes as far as I'm concerned, but I really want to thank both of you for this very thought-provoking, interesting, and lively conversation. I think I speak for Katja when I say we both enjoyed it immensely. And on behalf of 1014 and the American Council on Germany, I just want to thank both of you for taking the time to talk with us. And of course, a big thanks to our viewers for some great questions. I know we couldn't get to quite all of them, but it means that there is more to talk about when it comes to these issues, and we hope we'll have you both back again. Maybe not in 3 years, maybe we can manage it sooner than that, but this was a really great exchange. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both.